to Bookmas. I can't believe that there's only a couple days left of Bookmas. It's been so fun doing these daily videos. Difficult and challenging, but also really, really fun. And so I hope you guys have been enjoying them as we've been going through the holidays together. Today is the video I think a lot of you have been waiting for. I'm going to be talking about my top 24 reads from 2024. This is probably going to be a little bit of a longer video, so we're going to waste no time and get started. I will be going in order from the bottom of the 24 to first place and my favorite book of the year. So let's get into it. When I was picking these top 24 books, it was really easy to do the top half of them, like top 10 or top 12, just because it was obviously all of my 5-star books and then clearly some other front runners from 4 stars or 4.5 or 4.75 stars. But at the bottom half of those 24 books, it was honestly really difficult to rank them in order because they all kind of are on the same level playing field to me. But I did the best I could and I feel pretty solid with my list so far. So in my 24th spot, I am putting Beach Read by Emily Henry. This is technically a reread for me, but there just was no other book that I felt good enough putting on this list. And I kept coming back to Beach Read. I kept wanting to mention it. It just made a lot of sense. This was my first Emily Henry book that I ever read, and it was a couple years ago. I think it was back in the summer of 2020. It was also kind of one of the first romance books that I ever read as well. I think in my mind at the time, the genre was the cheesy romance, horribly written books, the period dramas with the covers, you know, the covers where there's like a guy with long hair and a 6-pack on the front. And I was like, no, I'm never gonna read romance. That's ridiculous. But then Beach Read showed up on Book of the Month. I was just drawn to it for some reason, and I think I really wanted to start reading romance, but I still had a little bit of preconceived notions about the genre as a whole. Beach Read really helped me dismantle some of those existing opinions that I had and really showed me what the romance genre could be and why I ended up liking it so much. So this follows our two main characters, January and Augustus. They're both writers and they both end up in this beach town at the same time, and they're neighbors. They also happen to be sort of rivals in the author space. Specifically, I think January thinks of Gus as a rival because he just kind of keeps stealing her thunder over the years, and so she doesn't really like him that much. But they slowly kind of start to form a friendship and a relationship, and they end up falling into this bet where Gus has to write a romance book and January has to write the next great American novel, essentially, both of which are outside of their normal genres. So it's kind of a challenge, and the first person that gets their book published wins, and then the other person, the loser, has to give an endorsement for the book. So it's kind of this game, this bet that they're playing. It's a little bit of enemies to lovers, but more maybe like rival / unexpected friendship to lovers. I just think the setting is really beautiful. The writing is really beautiful. There's a lot of deep topics that are handled in this, a lot of difficult topics that I think Emily Henry does a good job of handling and describing and walking the characters through, and I really appreciated that about this book. But my favorite thing about this book and any Emily Henry book is the dialogue. I truly think that Emily Henry is the queen of dialogue. It feels so realistic while still having that little touch of whimsy for a romance book. The characters are witty, they're funny. They both speak in voices that really feels true to the character themselves and how you've grown to know them. And it just is really great, and everything is packaged together to make such a wonderful book. And this is one of my favorite Emily Henry books for sure. So I had to include this in the list. All right, next on the list is Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. Potentially this was the first Agatha Christie book that I ever read. It's also my favorite Agatha Christie book that I've read. I haven't read a ton of her library, but I definitely have a few good ones under my belt, and this one just is so classic mystery, classic Agatha Christie to me. It follows our 10 characters that are lured to this island for various reasons, and they slowly start dying one by one, and everybody that is remaining after the next death is trying to figure out who the killer is, because there's nobody else on the island except these 10 people. There's no way for them to escape the island either. So they're all trying to solve the same mystery while potentially solving the mystery with the killer themselves. It's so classic. Agatha Christie has such a distinct writing style. She really paved the way for mystery writers, also female writers. There really weren't a lot of successful female authors at the time, and I just think that is so cool and awesome about her. I love her books. They really are kind of comfort reads in a way, even though the material is so dark, she really doesn't stray away from dark scenarios for sure. And I appreciate that about her as well, because it's not even that scary at the same time. You're just so intrigued. You're on the edge of your seat. It really is like a page turner, popcorn sort of read. She's just so awesome. And this is top notch, one of her best books in my opinion. So if you're looking for a good mystery that's pretty easy to get through, it's a small book, it's big old font. I think it's less than 300 pages. You can read this really, really fast. You can totally binge it if you're in the mood for a good mystery. And I think it's just so great. So this was also a reread for me this year. I only reread 3 books this year that I had previously read, and 2 of them made it into the top 24. So there's that one. Next book on this list is going to be When the Moon Hatched by Sarah Parker. I always forget how big this book is until I actually pick it up. This is a hefty, hefty book. And for a first book in a series too, there was a lot of world building, a lot of foundation to set before you could actually get into the plot. It is really worth it to get through that world building, because I think that this is one of the coolest fantasy worlds that I have read this year for sure. So the premise is kind of that the world that we're in was created by these gods. They call them the creators. People in this world are able to hear the gods singing to them, and if they can learn the song of a particular god, then they're able to use specific powers. It's usually like elemental magic. You can have fire power or water or air or something like that. So there are certain groups of people in this world that have magical abilities. There are also some that do not. There's also dragons in this world, and when a dragon dies, they fly up into the sky and they turn into stone, and they're called moons. And so in this world you can see all of these different dragon moons in the sky, and sometimes they will crack and they'll fall and they'll crash into the earth, and so that kind of upsets the balance of some things. Our main character is Rave, and she is very, very mysterious for a main character for most of the book. She actually doesn't remember most of her past, and we're not sure why until nearly the very end. So our main character that we're following along with is a huge mystery, and it's really kind of difficult to get to know her for most of the book, but she's really, really intriguing. She is kind of working with this rebellion group to take down some of these corrupt rulers in the world. We also follow our other main character, Khan, who recognizes Rave from his past, so he has a lot of information on her that he's kind of withholding. It's very political. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of betrayal. There's a lot of action in this as well, and especially with the magic system of the gods and the dragons, it just all kind of worked together to create a really, really cool fantasy. I think that it might be a little bit too long though. I feel like if it had been edited down even an extra 100 pages, if we could get down to like 600, 500 pages, I think it would have felt a little bit more concise and clear, whereas some of the scenes and some of the chapters and just sections of this book feel like they drag on a little bit, and it's not that bad because especially at the end it really, really picks up and gets very action-packed, and I was blazing through it at the end. The reason that it's making it on this list is because I just think the world is really, really cool. It's the first in a series. It ended on a pretty major cliffhanger, and I'm super excited to see where it goes. Moving right along, this one was a surprise to me, but I am gonna put Better Than the Movies by Lynn Painter on here. I've talked about this before, but I was very hesitant to read this book because I didn't think that I would enjoy a young adult romance. I like young adult books, specifically fantasy young adult books. I think I've always enjoyed them. I think I gravitate more towards adult or new fiction versus young adult right now just because of my preferences in reading style, but I still love young adult books. However, young adult romance was something that I had never read before and didn't really have an interest in reading. I think I was mostly afraid that I wouldn't be able to connect to any of the characters because there was such a big age gap between me and them, but I had heard so many good things about this book specifically. I had only read one other Lynn Painter book before, which was Happily Never After, and I didn't really like that one. That's an adult romance book. That was honestly an incredibly mediocre read, and it kind of made me not want to read any more Lynn Painter, but people love Better Than the Movies, and I've heard so many good things about it, and I really just needed to see what was up, and so I kind of picked it up on a whim. Honestly, it was such a big surprise. I enjoyed it so much, and I was really not expecting to. So it kind of follows our main characters, Liz and Wes. Liz is grieving the loss of her mother, who she lost a couple years ago, but now being in her senior year year of high school. She's going through all of these firsts, like buying her dress to prom, going to prom, applying to colleges, potentially moving away, all of these kind of big life moments that in her mind she had always pictured going through with her mom. And now that her mom isn't with her, she's really going through fresh waves of grief. And I think that particular plot point was handled really, really well by Lynn Painter. She did it in a way where it didn't seem far-fetched, it didn't seem cheesy, it actually felt like our main character was dealing with something kind of tough. I think one of the reasons why it felt like it was so realistic is because it's not the only thing that Liz is thinking about throughout the entire book. I think when you have gone through that type of grief, especially over a couple of years, it's not always forefront in your mind at any given time. It just kind of comes in waves that are really surprising and could be triggered by the most random things. And I feel like that was represented with Liz really well here, where she just is processing through grief in a way that felt really, really realistic. So that's kind of her backstory, but the book itself takes place where Liz and Wes, who is her next door neighbor, but they're not really close or friends, Liz and Wes pair up to try and get Liz's childhood crush to notice her and like her and ask her to the prom. It's very funny, it's very sweet. I think the relationship between Liz and Wes develops really, really well. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is like a friends to lovers trope, because at the beginning of the book, Liz kind of makes it clear that yeah, her and Wes grew up together, they played together a lot as kids, but they don't hang out right now. They don't really know each other as teenagers and in this current stage of life. So in a lot of ways, you're watching them get to know each other, but also they have so much history at the same time. It was really, really fascinating and I enjoyed it a lot. Again, it was funny, it was cute, I was smiling through it, I was enjoying myself immensely, but the whole time I was just surprised that I was enjoying myself so much. So this one is so sweet. There is a second book to this that I haven't really seen anybody talk about yet. It's pretty new. I'm gonna try to avoid seeing what people are saying. I am excited to read it, but it kind of is the continuation of Liz and Wes's story. Even though this one ends pretty conclusively, I think you could totally read this and not move on to the second book, but I am excited to read that. So this is better than the movies, and that was a fun one. Okay, next we have One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This one is a pretty recent fantasy read for me. I also have the special edition from Barnes & Noble that I am completely obsessed with. I love it so much. This one is a fantasy book that I was really pleased with, mostly because I think from the synopsis and what I had heard about it, I was really expecting it to follow a formula of romantasy and fantasy books that I've read recently. I think that there's been a lot of rinse and repeat with that genre lately, and not even in a bad way, because the formula works and we like it for a reason, but I was just expecting this to feel like everything else, and it honestly did not. This was such a unique magic system and world, really unlike anything I feel like I've read potentially ever. To give a brief rundown of it, I've gone into a lot more depth about this book in previous videos, so I will try to keep this really short, but I feel like the magic system is so complex, I have a hard time shortening it because you need as much information as you need. We're in this world, this kingdom, and there's this spirit of the woods that has basically cursed the land, where you can get an infection, and if you get an infection, you potentially may get magical powers to go along with that infection, but it's very frowned upon. It's super taboo. If you are infected or if a family member is infected, the king is coming to get you and you are sentenced to death. Your family is sentenced to death for treason. And the reason that it is looked down upon so much is that when you are infected and when you have magical powers, yes, those powers may be cool, but it also comes with a price. That's the whole point of this book, is that magic has a price, and honestly, magic is not good in this book. It's not necessarily evil or bad, but it's really seen as balanced and neutral, where yes, magic may have positive influences and impacts, but you pay a huge price for it that is very, very negative. So the infected, when they get these magical powers, they have some sort of degeneration with them as well. So you could start to lose your mind and go mad, or your body could start to break down and stuff like that. There's also this magical deck of cards that the old king made when he was making bargains with the spirit of the woods that cursed everybody. There's 12 specific cards in the deck, but then there's a different amount of cards per card. So the most common card that you can get is called the Black Horse, and there's lots of those cards, and all of the king's guards cards usually carry a black horse because it gives you super strength and combat prowess and stuff like that. There's a card where you can turn invisible. There's a card where you can use it as a truth serum. There's a card where you can read people's minds. And the more powerful the card, the more rare it is and the less amount of that card there actually is. So the legend of this world is that if you unite all 12 cards in the deck, you'll be able to break this curse that is over the kingdom. So our main character, Elspeth, is infected, but she's undercover infected. Nobody actually knows that she's infected and nobody knows what her magical power is, but she gets swept up in this rebel group that's trying to unite the deck to be able to break the curse. And they want to break the curse for good, but the king of this realm as well is trying to unite the deck too, but he's corrupt and evil and bad. So it's kind of a race to who can get the cards first. I think the plot was so strong in this book. Like I said before, I think the world building is so strong in this book. I loved both of those things. I think the characters in this book are a little bit weak. I liked them, but they felt pretty stagnant, not really developing a lot, not really making choices that further the plot. They were just kind of going along with the pre-existing plot, and it didn't really hinder the plot necessarily, but I really want to see some depth and some development to these characters that we've been introduced to in book 2. I haven't read book 2 yet. I'm very excited to read it. I think I'm going to read it in the new year. I want to see the characters develop there just because I feel like I didn't get a lot of that in this book. It felt more plot driven and more world building and foundation, which is not bad, but I was missing the character part of the book. But overall, still immensely enjoyed it, and it definitely earned a spot on my top 24 books. All right, this is one that I read way back in January, and that is House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. I think that the Crescent City trilogy is a little bit controversial with Sarah J. Maas fans. I think you're kind of divided on whether you like it or not. Obviously, it feels like Throne of Glass is very beloved by the fans. ACOTAR, I think, is also mostly very beloved by the fans, but there's a larger group of people that think it is overrated. This one, I think that you either love it or you hate it. There's not a lot of neutral ground for Crescent City. And for book 1, the first time that I read book 1, it was right when it was released because I had just finished ACOTAR and I loved the series so much. And I saw that book 1 of Crescent City came out and I was really, really excited to read it. So I read that and I really didn't like it. I was mostly confused by the story. It was very descriptive. The world was really, really hard to follow and I didn't love the characters. I just didn't really like it that much. It was fine and I still enjoyed it because it is that kind of fantasy book that I enjoy, but overall it was such a step down for me. Flash forward and book 3 in Crescent City is coming out and I'm like, okay, I really need to read book 2 and I think I need to reread book 1 because I don't remember a lot of what is going on. My reread of book 1 of Crescent City, I suddenly was obsessed with it. I think because I had read it a while ago and I already had a little bit of the foundation for the world building, I was able to forget those details and not pay attention to them and really focus on the characters and the plot. And Crescent City, the second time I read through it, was easily a 5-star for me. I loved it so much. And so then I was able to roll straight into House of Sky and Breath, and I needed to finish this very, very fast in January because I wanted to go and buy book 3 as soon as it was released on the day. So I read this as fast as I could, and it was such a fun time. It was great to be back in the world of Crescent City. I liked the characters. I loved the development and the directions that they were heading. The end of this book, if you know, you know, there is so much going on. It is so action-packed. It's a lot, and it was a really, really fun time. I think she set up a lot for book 3 that honestly maybe didn't really deliver in book 3, but we're not talking about book 3 right now. We're talking about book 2. I loved book 2. I think it does fall into the category a little bit of, this is probably a little bit too long. We're following a lot of characters. There's a lot of descriptions right now. Maybe not a lot that is super, super pertinent to the plot, but I'm having a good time. And so this, you know, I had to. If not just for the general enjoyment of this book, then definitely for the ending, this had to be on my top 24. So next on my list is actually another sequel, and that is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. So I also read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies for the first time earlier this year, and I really liked that book. It was very cozy, it was very slow, sweet, super easy read. I had a great time. This book I liked a lot more than the first one though, which was pretty surprising to me because I really did enjoy the first one a lot, but this one I think had a little bit more action. It had a lot more character development and interaction between characters. So we basically follow Emily Wilde, who is a professor, and in the first book, she is writing her Encyclopedia of Fairies. So she goes to this far northern town, Sweden potentially, or some sort of Nordic village to study these fairies. And she writes her encyclopedia throughout that book. Lots of stuff happens. I can't really say a lot about this book without giving some spoilers away from the first one, so I'm gonna be pretty vague. But in this one, she has published her encyclopedia and she is working on a map of the Otherlands. The Otherlands is just basically like fairy realm. It's where the fairies are from, it's where they live. So she's working on a map of it, and kind of the same thing. We're going on an adventure. We're going to, I think we're in Austria, and she is cataloging things and all of this type of stuff. The reason that I love these books so much is actually it's designed to be like you're reading Emily's journal. So it's not written in kind of the traditional chapter form way. It's written in diary entries from Emily's perspective. Emily's a really particular character. She is very literal, very logical. And so her accounts of things, like sometimes she will be writing something that happened that she didn't understand because it was maybe a little bit more hypothetical or a little sarcastic or something like that. And she doesn't get it because she's so literal and logical, but the reader gets it. And so we kind of sometimes have a little bit more knowledge and insight into her diary entries than even Emily does. And that was a really fun experience to be a part of that. I think the writing is super clever, it's super interesting, and all of the characters in this book are awesome. It has a really sweet romance in it that is a continuation from book one as well. I won't really go into that a lot because there's definitely lots of spoilers. If you're looking for a cozy fantasy with really funny characters and interesting writing, then I think this would be a great book for you to pick up. Okay, so we've just hit on a couple fantasy books back to back, but now we have a literary fiction called My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry. This is also one that I read at the very beginning of the year, but I loved it so much and it has definitely stuck with me throughout the year. So we follow our main character, Elsa, who's actually a 7-year-old girl. She is really intelligent. She is wise beyond her years for sure. She has a very close relationship with her grandmother. And Elsa, her grandmother, her mom, and her stepdad all live in the same apartment building, and you meet slowly all the other characters that also live in the same building throughout this book. At the very, very beginning of the book, Elsa's grandmother dies, and Elsa is left with a bunch of envelopes from her that are addressed to people in the building with a task for Elsa to go around and give these letters to the right people. Elsa then learns that the letters end up being apologies, and her grandmother is saying sorry to all of the tenants in the apartment building because honestly, this grandma was crazy. She was really crotchety, really quirky. She loved playing pranks on people. She would yell at people. She just was super unique, and most of the people in the apartment building didn't like her. So she is sending letters to apologize, and Elsa is going on this journey of meeting new people, gathering their stories, learning a lot about the apartment building and the people that live in it, and it's really, really beautiful, and I loved how it was written. This was my first Friedrich Bachmann novel. It definitely makes me want to read a lot more from him. I think the next one that I would love to read is Anxious People. I've also heard a lot of good things about Beartown, and obviously A Man Called Ove. This was kind of my first introduction to him as an author, and I'm really glad that I was introduced to him. So that's that. Oh, shocker, we've got another Emily Henry book on this list. As a preface, this was the year that I read every single Emily Henry book that was published, and so next is Funny Story. I picked this up from the bookstore the day that it was released. I was really excited to read it, and I would say that it didn't let me down at all. It was definitely a fun read. I was not disappointed by it. So we follow our main character, Daphne, and her counterpart, Miles. At the beginning of the book, Daphne is engaged to a man called Peter, like very very close to walking down the aisle with him. And Miles is in a relationship with a woman called Petra. Petra and Peter are actually childhood best friends, I think, and they are really, really close. But anytime people have asked them if they would get together, if they have feelings for each other, it's always, oh no, we're just friends. There's nothing going on. We could never be together, which is not true, because at the very beginning of this book, Peter leaves Daphne to run away with Petra. So Miles is heartbroken because Petra is leaving him, but Daphne is really the one that is screwed over here because she lives with Peter in his house that he owns. She moved her entire life to this town that they live in to be with Peter and to marry him. All of her friends are basically his friends. She doesn't have a life apart from Peter. And now he's like, hey, I'm running off with this different woman, and also you need to move out. And Daphne's like, okay, hey Miles, do you have a spare bedroom? Because what else is she gonna do in that moment? So Miles and Daphne move in together, and so we've got a roommate scenario, roommates trope, and then they start fake dating to try and make Peter and Petra jealous. But even more than just making them jealous, I think they really just wanted to save face, because naturally they're gonna cross paths at some point, and specifically Daphne really wanted to just be like, hey, I'm good, I don't need you, we're happy, I'm dating this other guy now. So it's a fake dating situation as well, which is really fun. I think the thing that I liked so much about this book is following the character of Daphne, because in the beginning of the book, she is a very dependent person on Peter. She has no life outside of him and is not very confident, is not very sure of herself, because she's built everything she knows around this guy that she's been with. And so now that that has been ripped away from her, she kind of has to learn how to rebuild her life and be an independent woman. And so slowly through the book, she makes her own friends. She really feels secure in her job. She's looking for places to live. She's kind of like rebuilding her life, but by herself, and learning how to be dependent on herself and not other people. And that was just done really beautifully. I loved seeing her go through that. I loved seeing her succeed. Miles was fine. Like, he was a good character. He was enjoyable, but I didn't love him. He definitely was not up there in my favorite Emily Henry male main characters, but I thought their relationship was cute. I mostly was just here for Daphne's story, and that's why I liked it so much. And of course, Emily Henry's writing is, as always, top notch, and the setting was beautiful and the dialogue was fantastic. So that's why this one's on the list. Next, we've got a fun one. This is one that I actually read from a blind book date box. I had no idea what it was when I was opening it, but it ended up being If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This book was definitely a surprise to me. I had no preconceived notions about it. I had never heard anybody talk about it up until this point, and I was really, really excited to dive into it. So our main character, his name is Oliver, and at the very beginning of the book, he's actually being released from prison where he's been incarcerated for 10 years. He sits down on this park bench with the detective that was on his case and is basically like, okay, I'm ready to tell my story. Because at the time that the crime happened that ended up putting him in prison, he was not really saying anything about it. He wasn't telling the full story, and the detective could kind of tell that there was more that needed to be said, but there was nothing that he could do. And so Oliver went to prison for 10 years. So the story opens up, and actually it's Oliver telling his story. So we get a little bit of narrative breaks in between the storytelling where we're in the present tense, we're in the park bench hearing Oliver tell a story, but most of the book takes place in the past tense, where Oliver is enrolled at this super fancy, rich school in specifically the Shakespearean theater department. And the book takes place centered around Oliver and his core group of friends as they are all studying Shakespeare and theater. I thought that premise was really, really interesting. One of the things that was so different to any other book that I've read before is there's a lot of actual quoted Shakespeare in this book. I remember saying at the end of reading this book that I had never read so much Shakespeare in my entire life until I had read this book. It really is a very core part, and I think you can tell that the author knows Shakespeare well and has clearly studied him and studied his works and was able to incorporate it in the writing very, very well. So throughout this book, we're getting to know this group of friends, we're getting to know Oliver. They all kind of come from different backgrounds. They're very, very different from each other, but they just kind of work as this core family group. But about halfway through the book, something happens that pretty much rips the group apart and is ultimately what caused Oliver to go to prison. So we're basically at the mercy of Oliver's storytelling for when we're actually going to figure out what truly happened. And it's a really fun way to be taken on a journey by the main character telling you this story. As a reader, I just really liked the perspective and the way that it was written. It's very dark academia, which was fun. Everything about it was just very interesting and fascinating to me, and I liked it so much, enjoyed it immensely. So highly recommend this one if you haven't read it. It's great to read specifically in the fall. Next, we honestly have another kind of similar writing style as If We Were Villains, and that is Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. I say that it's similar to If We Were Villains because this really takes place around a character telling a story again. What's even more interesting about this one is that it actually is a couple different layers of a story being told, because our main character, Laura, is telling the story of her life to her daughters, but as the reader, she's also telling us the story of how she told her daughters the story of her life. So it feels like a story inception, and that was a super fun time. I enjoyed that so much. So Laura, whoa, this one also takes place in like a theater setting. Wow, I didn't realize that as I was ranking everything, that some books kind of grouped together similarly. So Laura grew up doing theater, specifically this one show called Our Town. She's done it a couple times, but the chunk of the story really takes place at this theater group called Tom Lake. And she basically just tells the story of her relationships, her career at the time, how she met her husband, and it's very sweet and gentle the way that it's told. It also takes place during 2020, so all of her daughters have come from different parts of the country and are isolating in place on their family cherry tree farm. I think this book was just very relaxing, very cozy, very sweet. I loved the character of Laura, and I loved seeing her in the past tense described in her own words, but then also seeing her in present tense as she is talking to her daughters and dealing with her family, and also her relationship with her husband now. And the whole setting takes place in northern Michigan, which is really, really wonderful and cool. I think this would be a great summer read just because of the setting alone, but also any time of the year. I think the writing really speaks for this book specifically. It's just very, very beautifully done. And like I said, that relationship between the main character and us as the reader, where it feels like Laura is actually talking to us and we're the one she's telling the story to, and then every other story that's being told is kind of like a past tense backseat sort of thing. And it was just very interesting. It was almost like us and Laura were in on it more than other people were. And I like when authors like Ann Patchett can create that relationship between readers and a main character. I just think it was done really, really well. So this was a great book that I would highly recommend. Okay, I think we're like halfway done. Oh my gosh. I think I'm gonna try to speed up a little bit here. I'm getting too long-winded on these books, but I can't help myself. The next book we're gonna talk about is Divine Rivals. I solely picked up this book because of the hype that it was getting, and honestly, I was not let down. That doesn't happen to me a lot, where a book is hyped up and it really matches the hype that it's getting. So Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross follows these two rivals, Iris and Roman, and they are both journalists, kind of at the same newspaper, and they're both fighting for a pretty intense promotion. But while that is happening, Iris's brother is fighting in a war. Now, this war has been going on in this world for a really long time, and it's just kind of all you've ever known is this war happening, and the war is happening between these two divine gods who may also be rivals, if you will. Iris's brother is fighting in this war for a particular god against the other god and his troop of people, and Iris misses him very much, and so kind of in a cathartic way, she writes to her brother at the front. She writes him letters, but she has nowhere that she can actually send it, and so she has been stuffing these letters underneath her wardrobe door because she doesn't really know what else to do with them, but she needs to write these letters to emotionally help her. Turns out her typewriter is magic, and those letters are getting into the hands of her rival, Roman Kit. Roman starts writing back to her, and they begin a letter writing relationship, and that's how they fall in love, and it's so great. I love it so much. I love when characters write letters back and forth to each other, and that's how they develop, and that's how they get to know each other, and it was done really, really well here. I think Rebecca Ross is a beautiful writer, very lyrical, very romantic writing style, and the world was super cool, and Iris and Roman as characters were absolutely adorable, and I loved their relationship that developed. It ends on a pretty intense cliffhanger going into the second book. Also, the second book is not good, but this book I loved so much, had such a great time, highly recommend. Ooh, next we've got a mystery book. One of the only mystery books on the list up there with Agatha Christie, but it's The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. I had heard so many things about this book and just never really picked it up because I'm not much of a mystery reader. This really was the year of trying to read more mystery for me, though. The problem was I read this one pretty early on and it was so good that then all of the rest of the mystery books I would compare to this one and they just all fell short. Nothing was as good as this mystery book that I read this year. So this follows Theo, who is also our narrator, and he is a psychotherapist at a mental asylum, and he is particularly attracted to this one character whose name is Alicia. Alicia was this very, very famous artist who many years ago killed her husband in a pretty rageful attack, but she didn't go to prison because she very clearly was mentally unwell and was able to claim asylum in this mental hospital. Since the incident with her husband, she has not spoken a single word in many, many years. Theo thinks that he can help her. He thinks that he can get her to talk. He kind of becomes a little bit obsessed with her and obsessed with helping her, and that's kind of how our plot develops. This book is creepy. It's a little bit dark. There's some disturbing things that happen. The whole underlying tension that's going on and just the feeling of the book is unsettling, but in a way that's so fun. If that's what you're looking for in the moment, obviously we don't always want to read that type of stuff, but if you want to read it in the fall when things are getting really spooky and you just kind of want a good mystery thriller, this book was super thrilling, and the twist at the end is really great. I know not a lot of people like it, and a lot of people say that it was predictable. I could not predict it. I think I'm bad at predicting mystery endings, but it was a shock to me, and I had a great time with it. Also, one of the things that I love, at least about my copy, I don't know if this is on everybody's copy, but Alex Michaelides at the end of his book gives you a list of the 5 best plot twists in fiction, and he lists 5 Little Pigs by Agatha Christie, The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford, Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I think that's just really cool that an author is supporting other authors and really showing that he loves the genre, he loves the plot twists, and was maybe inspired by some of those really good twists. So I just liked it so much. This really is my standard for mystery thrillers right now. Next we have the first and one of the only sci-fi books to make this list. It's Project Hail Mary. So Andy Weir is one of my favorite authors. I've read The Martian, Artemis, and Project Hail Mary, and I love his writing style. It's very, very particular. I know that there are people out there that hate this writing style, and that's fine. It's so niche that I could see how some people wouldn't like it. I am on the other side though, and I absolutely love it. I think that Andy Weir tackles some very intense topics and subject matters and makes them really funny. Everything about his books are actually really lighthearted, but it's about a man that's stuck on Mars and a woman that's trying to uncover this crazy plot on the moon. And this one, Ryland Grace, is trying to save the literal world by himself in space. That's what this book is about. There is this foreign alien substance that is basically eating away at the Earth's sun, and Ryland Grace is a scientist that basically becomes the only one equipped to go up into space and research this alien substance and try to find a solution. And so that's what he does. Most of the book takes place in present tense, where Ryland is up in space alone doing all of his work trying to figure stuff out, and in past tense, where it's talking about how Ryland got to that position of being the one to go up into space. I just liked it so much. This one definitely deserves a place on the top list, but also I know I'm biased because I love the author himself, but this was just funny. I laughed out loud a lot of times. This may be top contender for one of the funniest books that I've read this year, if not the funniest. Especially if you don't like sci-fi, which I'm not a huge sci-fi person. This doesn't feel like you have to love sci-fi in order to enjoy this book. I think you can just go into it and love the characters, love the story. The plot is very exciting and thrilling, and I think the ending was awesome. So, big fan of Project Hail Mary. Okay, this one I must preface a little bit because I read this when I was really searching for a 5-star read, and I was reading a lot of fantasy. I read tons of books specifically in the fantasy genre, and all of them were falling short, and I was getting really burnt out, and I was really unhappy, and I didn't know what to read. And so on a whim, I picked up The Serpent and the Wings of the Night. And honestly, this book was exactly what I needed at that moment. It came to me at exactly the right right time, and I loved it. I ended up rating it a 5-star because it gave me that feeling of wanting to read. It almost pulled me out of like a potential reading slump. I was really diving down into just the bog of, gosh, I'm getting so burnt out, I don't want to be reading right now. And this book got me right out of that. It made me excited to read it. I was super invested in the story and the characters, and that's honestly why I rated it a 5-star. Looking back on it now, I think if I had read it at a different time or in a different season, I wouldn't have liked it that much, just because I think the story is not necessarily my favorite. I don't love the world. I don't know. It's a really weird one for me, but it has to be on this list because I rated it a 5-star. I think it just goes to show how your mood can affect your reading and how specific that is. There could be a book on this list that I'm saying I absolutely loved, but if I read it at the wrong time, I potentially could have hated it, and vice versa. There's books that I really, really didn't like this year that maybe if I had read in a different mood, I would have enjoyed it. So for whatever reason, this one tapped into this mood. It's a vampire romance book. It takes place in like a games competitive style plot. Our romance is a rivalry and they hate each other to start, and you know, it just kind of follows the formula for a romantasy or a fantasy book. There's really not a lot of new content here, and that's kind of why I feel like if I had read it at a different time, I wouldn't have liked it as much. But for whatever reason, it just hit when it hit, and that is what matters. The next one is one that I've talked about countless times on this channel, and I'm gonna do it again. It's The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. Easily one of the top books that I've read this year. It's a debut book for Gareth Brown, which is crazy to me. This doesn't feel like a debut at all. It really feels like the author is seasoned and experienced with publishing, and maybe he is, and this is just kind of the first one that got picked up, but it's so good. I'm not gonna go really deep into the plot and synopsis because honestly, pick any other video on this channel and Book of Doors will probably show up. But it takes place in a world where there are certain magical books that can affect things like how you feel pain, how you feel joy. It can give you sadness, it can take away sadness, all of these different stuff. Depending on how the books are used, they can be used for good or for evil. There's kind of these two groups of people that are trying to get these books and collect the books. One over here that's going to use them for nefarious reasons, and one over here that wants to protect the books and maybe lock them away so that they aren't used for evil. Our main character stumbles upon one of the most rare books and the most valuable books called The Book of Doors. The Book of Doors is able to transport you anywhere in the world if you can picture the door itself, even down to like, I'm gonna Google an image of a door in Italy and I'm gonna be transported exactly to that door when I picture it. So it's very valuable, and our main character gets a hold of this book, and then everybody is chasing her. The good guys are chasing her, the bad guys are chasing her because they want this book, and she's like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do right now. This old man just gave me this book and now everybody wants to kill me. Poor girl. It was just beautiful. This is such an exciting read. The bad guys in it, the antagonists, are really intimidating, really scary, and the good guys, you are rooting for them so hard, and it just feels like such a great good versus evil classic fantasy novel, and I'm such a huge fan of it, as always. Okay, next is a pretty recent read for me. I actually read it in the month of November, and that is Welcome to the Homdong Bookshop. This one is also a really interesting book for me to talk about because it's very unlike anything else that I've read this year. It's a Korean translated book, and in Korea, it's actually considered in the healing fiction genre, which is so sweet. It literally is the epitome of a cozy book that I can think of. It follows all of these characters around the setting of a bookshop in this neighborhood. And there's not really a ton of plot going on. You're just kind of dropped into a setting, almost like an observer to these different character vignettes, and you learn about what they've been through to get them to where they are in their life right now. You learn about their past and their ambitions and what they want to do, and how this bookshop really feeds life and joy and hope into the neighborhood. And it's all just in this beautiful back setting of Korea, and it's written really, really wonderfully. It's a very romantic writing style, but honestly, the reason that this book is so high up for me is because of the vibes. This book is so cozy, and so I wanted every time I sat down to read this book feel so cozy to kind of match that. So I always had the fire on. It was snowing at the time. I would get a hot drink. I would have a blanket, and it just made me so happy. And the reading experience itself is actually why I'm rating this so highly. Not even because of the story, the writing, the characters, anything like that, although those were all good. The reason that it's so high up for me is just because I had such a good time reading this book. and I love it. It's a warm hug. This book is straight up a warm hug. Next, we've got The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This was a book that I read pretty early in the year as well, and I really enjoyed this one. I know there's a lot of people that don't necessarily enjoy it, but this follows our main character, Nora, who in the very first sentence lets you know that she is going to end her life. And she does. She ends her life, but she's sucked into the Midnight Library, which is kind of this world between worlds where it's all of these books around Nora. And it is explained to Nora that if she were to take one of the books off of a shelf and read it, she would be transported to a different version of her life where she made different choices. So Nora is basically given the opportunity to try on a different life if she had made a different choice. And it's kind of about your what ifs, it's about your regrets, but ultimately it's about finding life and beauty in what you already have and learning to let go of those what ifs and those regrets. And I think it was just really beautifully written. It was really lighthearted and sweet for such an actual dark subject matter, which was a fun juxtaposition. I do want to say that some people's critiques to this book, I have researched a little bit more and looked into a little bit more, and I think it's super valid, where this book may take a little bit too casual of a stance on some really important and difficult mental health issues that our main character is going through. And if you are somebody that is struggling with the same things that Nora is struggling with, this may seem like a slap in the face, honestly. Like, we can't all go to the Midnight Library and try on our different lives, then learn to be happy with what we have. And that is completely valid and totally makes sense. So I do see that part of maybe why people don't enjoy it as much. Overall, though, I still had a really good time reading it, and I personally was able to connect with it and enjoy it a lot. Okay, we are down to our top 5 books. Number 5, Remarkably Bright Creatures. The reason that I like this book so much is because there is a character called Marcellus, and he is the octopus. It follows Tova, this old woman who is kind of resisting retirement and resisting her old age by working at an aquarium and still kind of trying to maintain her autonomy and her independent lifestyle versus going into a nursing home. It also follows Cameron, who is this 30-some guy who really lacks all ambition, all direction in life. He was dealt a pretty difficult hand of cards in his childhood, and that just didn't set him up super well. He's very smart, but he's also kind of sneaky and crafty, and you kind of start out not liking him, but I think that his journey to really getting his feet under him in this book is good. He ultimately ends up working at the same aquarium that Tova does and crossing paths with her, and they kind of become friends. And then third is Marcellus, who is our octopus narrator. He has little narrative inserts within the book where he's the only one that's first person perspective, and he is an octopus in the aquarium that both Tova and Cameron are working at, and all of his chapters are just his observations about Tova and Cameron, and they're very funny. He is also a very literal narrator, but it's also kind of presented that Marcellus is the only one in the book that knows everything, and he's just kind of like annoyed with the other characters who don't know everything yet, and he's like, okay, well, catch up. If only they knew what I knew. And he was just very tongue-in-cheek and very cleverly written, and I enjoyed that so much, and I thought it was very unique. I definitely would not expect to read a book where one of the main characters is an octopus. I really enjoyed it. This book felt like a warm hug as well to me, just kind of a cozy, sweet, simple read with a happy ending, but written really beautifully, tackling some pretty difficult subject matters and topics like growing old and finding your place in life, and, you know, what do you do when an octopus steals your keys? So read this if you want answers to all of those questions. Number 4 is our last Emily Henry book on the list. No surprise, it's Happy Place. Although it also is a surprise because, as I've said before, I did not expect to like this book. It's a second chance romance. I really don't like second chance romances. But this book, even though it looks like a classic romance book, even though it sounds like a classic romance book, even though there is a romance plot within this book, I just never felt like I was reading a romance when I was going through it. It felt more like a character study on Harriet and Wynne, who are our 2 main characters. They were engaged for a really long time, but then had to call off their engagement because honestly life just got in the way. They didn't know how to communicate with each other. They were both going through really difficult things, and they just were broken people trying to learn how to love broken people, and they didn't know how to do it well, and that caused them to combust. They go to this beach house with all their friends as kind of like a last hurrah vacation that they do every single year, but none of their friends know that they've called off the engagement, so they have to pretend to still be together, and then ultimately, because they're kind of in a forced proximity thing, they start to talk about their problems and start to talk about what went wrong in our relationship. And I think it was just handled really, really well by Emily Henry, talking about something so specific, especially talking about what Harriet and Wynne were specifically dealing with that led to them breaking up. We also have a couple other side characters in this book that really get a good spotlight as well, and just the group as a whole, the dynamics that are explained, the way all of their relationships work, the conflicts that they go through and deal with in this book, I just thought was so good. It's such a strong character book, and I am such a character reader that this just checked every single box for me, and it really was probably the most surprising book of the year for me. I absolutely loved this book. I got emotional over this book. I can't recommend it enough. It's so good. Okay, so in the number 3rd spot for my top 24 books of 2024, it's The Ministry of Time. This one is a pretty recent read for me, and it's kind of hard to fit into a box, honestly. It could be a sci-fi, it could be a romance, it could be a literary fiction. It's just all of these things melding together to create one beautiful story. So we are in London, and the British government has figured out how to time travel, essentially, and they bring all of these people back from the past and they pair them up with people in the present to be a bridge for them to society and help them get acclimated to society. Our main character, who does not have a name in this book, but it's first person perspective, so that doesn't really bother you. She is paired with Graham Gore. He is from the 1800s. He's a military guy, and she has to live with him for an entire year and help him get acclimated to present day society as part of her job. She's getting paid to do that. Their relationship is so well done. It's so sweet. Even all of the relationships between the other bridges and the rest of the people that were brought from the past is so well done, because they're all from different time periods. We have people from the 1600s all the way up to the 1900s, and they are plopped right down into the 21st century and have to learn how to deal with that. And it's very, very interesting. I thought it was a super unique premise and plot. The thing that makes me love this book so much, though, is just kind of what our character deals with and really the deeper underlying themes of this book. So she is 50% Cambodian and her mother is an immigrant. So she grew up dealing with a lot of things with racism and just generational trauma from her mother and cultural impact that has affected her even in her adult life. So she's kind of going on this journey that you don't even realize in the beginning, but now looking back on the whole story, once you have the full picture, it's really a journey about forgiveness and mercy and hope. And our character from the beginning of the book all the way to the end of the book is like totally different, very developed. I connected to it very, very strongly. I know that it's pretty specific and definitely would fit into a specific box that maybe a lot of people can't connect with, but just the themes of the forgiveness that our character has to walk through and go through, specifically related to some generational trauma. It is just so beautifully done, and I was crying at the end of it. But then you also have this cute and funny romance happening at the same time, but then you have this crazy plot with the British government and time travel and like espionage and action at the end, and everybody's trying to save the world, and it's just like so much going on. But I think it was done really well, where you're able to kind of have these anchor points throughout the entire book. It's just so good. I am so happy about this book. It was really difficult for me to put in my 3rd spot. I wasn't sure if it should go higher, but ultimately this feels right to have in my number 3. Okay, so my runner-up and my number 1 book of the year is kind of funny, because I did a mid-year check-in book tag around like June or July this year, where I kind of talked about what my favorite books were from the year, and I had my number 1 spot, and it's now switched, and it's not my number 1 book of the year, but I had already read my number 1 book of the year. It's very confusing. Basically, as time has gone on and as I have sat with both of these books, I decided that I liked one more than the other. So my runner-up is Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. This one was also a bit of a surprise to me, because I had read one other Abby Jimenez book, Yours Truly, I think, and I didn't love it. I enjoyed myself for sure, but I was also reading Emily Henry at the time, and I was comparing the 2 books because they're kind of up there, just talked about in romance authors, and I just didn't love Yours Truly. It was fine. It was okay. I did like it, but I thought that I was going to like it a lot more and didn't end up getting to that spot. Just for the Summer, though, holy crap, it's so good. So it follows our 2 main characters, Emma and Justin, and they kind of have this curse on them where they date somebody for a couple weeks and then they break up, and that person goes on to find their soulmate and get married and live happily ever after. And it keeps happening to both of them. And one day Justin is so fed up about it that he posts on Reddit and is like, hey, I'm cursed. This is what's happening to me. Emma sees the post on Reddit, responds to him, contacts him, and is like, this is happening to me too. I am also cursed. And so through a series of events, they decide to date each other for a few weeks, break up, and then in theory, it would cancel out the curse and they would go on to find their soulmates. Turns out they're the soulmates though. It's so sweet. I loved both of these characters so much. They are both dealing with really difficult things throughout this book and kind of have a hard time talking to each other about it, asking each other for help. But the way that their relationship develops is beautiful. It is just beautiful. Specifically, Emma was such an interesting character because she has a lot of trauma from her past related to her mother, and it definitely influences the decisions that she makes in her adult life and in this book. And it's so frustrating and it's so annoying, and the whole time I'm like pulling my hair out because Emma is making the wrong choice again, and it's really pissing me off. But at the same time, you know exactly why she's responding that way and why she's making those decisions, because Abby Jimenez wrote it so well that she gave you all the information you need. And so it's frustrating, but that felt good because I was so invested in a character that I just wanted to see them make the right decision. And I think that was a sign of really, really good writing and good character development. There's so much more that I could say about this book, but we are so long in this video right now. I'm going to move on. Just for the Summer is so good. It was really hard for me not to put this in my top spot, but I just couldn't help it. And finally, my number one book of 2024. You probably will guess it. It's The Will of the Many by James Islington. As I was putting together this list, I was trying to remember why I ended up picking up The Will of the Many in the first place, because I don't really know that it was ever put in front of me often enough that I was like, oh, I really want to see that. Or I didn't see somebody's review on it that made me want to read it. I just kind of stumbled across it randomly and was like, yeah, I think I want to read that book. And then when I went on Goodreads and I saw how highly it was rated on Goodreads. Now, granted, you can't always trust Goodreads, but the numbers don't always lie. And it was rated so highly, I needed to give it a shot. This book got me. The world that it takes place in is kind of ancient Greek, ancient Roman inspired, and everybody in this world has magic, but it's called will, that they cede to people that are higher up above them. So it's a very class-based society. There's hierarchies that are very, very strong in this world. And if you are low on the totem pole, you are giving away your will, you're giving away your magic to the people higher above you. And that goes on and on and on to the very top, this top ruler of the world. Our main character is Viz, and he is going undercover at this academy in this world that there's some fishy stuff going on. And so he is sent to go kind of figure out what is up. So it takes place in a school setting, which is really cool. Viz is trying to work his way up in the ranks of the school through these classes and kind of trying to make a name for himself while also trying to investigate some very sketchy behavior that's going on. He also is very against this class-based society. He doesn't want to cede his will. He's kind of got a rebellious spirit, and there's so many things going on. The plot is really, really dense. I'm doing a horrible job at explaining it, but guys, it's so good. If you like fantasy, if you don't like fantasy, it doesn't really matter, honestly. It's so well written. You are so immersed into this world that it's kind of hard to pull yourself out of it. I almost went into a reading slump afterwards. I was completely attached to this book and the world that I was in. It's so incredible. I will say that about the first 150 pages were kind of slow for me because it's a lot of world building, but it's so worth it to get through, because then going into the rest of the pages, which it's pretty thick, but going into the rest of it, you have such a good foundation of this world and knowledge of the world that you're able to just focus on the plot and follow Viz. It's very action-packed and thrilling. The rest of the characters, the ensemble, are so good, but everything's kind of shrouded in mystery and you don't know who to trust and what's going on. Viz himself is a very mysterious character. You don't know a lot about him, and definitely he alludes to having a very specific past that I think we're going to get more reveals on in the next couple of books. But holy crap, this book is untouchable for me, truly untouchable. I have recommended it to so many different people. A lot of friends that I know then go on to read it, and also it's their favorite book of the year too. Just trust me on this one, guys. Read this book. If you like fantasy, if you don't like fantasy, I would put a lot on the line to guess that you would not regret it. I also read it on Kindle hot tip because it is really long and I sometimes get intimidated by kind of the length of a really chunky book and trying to read it. Kindle made it a lot easier for me because I could hide my page count. I didn't know where I was in the book and it was like a lighter thing to be able to hold and carry. So that was helpful. If you're intimidated by the size, consider reading it on an e-reader, but whatever you can do, whatever you have to do, read The Will of the Many. And there you have it. That is 24 books that we just talked about. My top 24 books for the year 2024. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to know what some of your top books are. And hopefully you found some good reads that you can add to your TBR for 2025. As always, thank you so much for joining me and hanging out with me on this corner of the internet. We will see you next time for more Bookmas.